Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, sir and friends. We are from Group 6. Today, we want to presentation our material about Reestablishment of English Part 2. Before we begin, I would like to introduce members of this group. There are Agustri, Ayu Martin, Aztri, Dera, Nalurytha, and myself, Putri, Wulan, Dari, and Sesilia Zulianty. Okay, let's get started. And next, the following are the points for our discussion. Firstly, the rise of the middle class. Secondly, general adoption of English in the 14th century. Third, English in the law courts. And then English in the school. And next, increasing ignorance of French in the 15th century. French as a language of culture and fashion, and the use of English in writing and less Middle English literature. The first and second material will be delivered by my friend Sesilia Zulianty. Sesilia Zulianty, time is yours.
The rise of the middle class. In the summer of 1348 in the southwest of England, a contagious disease arose. Occurred around the 14th century from 1347 or 1348 until 1351. The disease known as the Black Death killed about 2/3 of people in Europe. This disease is called the Black Death because in the sufferer there are black lumps that come from swelling of blood. Sufferer will feel excruciating pain, and if not treated for a period of a week, the sufferer is very likely to die. But we will not focus on this disease or discuss it from a scientific point of view, so we will go to the next slide. The disease changed several things, including the way of life in European countries in general and in England in particular. Here we can see that there are three impacts of the spread of this Black Death infectious disease. The first impact is make some countries become more developed. And the second impact is agricultural jobs have a greater burgeoning position. As in most pandemic, the rich suffer less than the poor, where people who were nobles at the time could better protect themselves. Meanwhile, usually farmers or people in the middle to lower class have to move or do activities outside the home to get their needs, so that this virus afflicts many farmers. This makes landowners lack of labor. As a result, agricultural workers have a greater burgeoning position. The third impact is the collapse of the old feudal system. This pandemic also had an impact on the collapse of the old feudal system because it had an impact on the demographic of farmers at that time, where people are forced to work to pay rent for the land they live on. This pushed Western Europe towards commercialization and becoming more modern by developing an economic system based on caste. General adoption of English in the 14th century. Beginning in 1066, William invaded and conquered England. The new conquerors, called the Normans, they brought French, which became the language of the royal palace and ruling and business class. In this period, there was a division of linguistic classes. The first is lower class spoke English, and the second is the upper class spoke French. At that time, the people in the palace know French, but they also understood English. In the 14th century, the English language began to find its peak in Europe, so that the French language was no longer as popular as before. French is only added in a few sentences of words, so this language is called Middle English. If you look at the previous material, it is clear that this is the impact of the Black Death, because all of this started with a shortage of labor. Then there was an increase in price everywhere, a shortage of consumers' goods, so that the economy became chaotic. Then people from the village flocked to the city in search of work because they were offered high wages. Because of this, the social status of the lower class increased, which then caused British people to have dominant political power. They also have the power to regulate the knowledge system, and British society then regulates the language they use. Then created a process of standardization of English as the language they use every day. Okay, so here are some English words taken from French that have been contained in tabular form. So we can see, for the example, the first is allowance. In English, we can say allowance, but in French, allowance. In English, allowance, but in French, allowance. Or athlete in English and athlete in French, or cliché in English and cliché in French, and etc. Alright, so for the next material will be present by Agustri. So Agustri, time is yours.
Thanks Cecilia for the time. Alright, at this point I will explain about English in law courts. First of all, we will discuss the opening that tells the story of the beginning of the English language in law courts. Do you know, in 1356, around the 14th century, after the Norman conquest, there was a clear practice of using English in all courts of law, including pleading, custom, etc., by mayors and councillors of London, and ordered that proceeding in a London sheriff court be conducted in the English. And then declaration of practice of English in the law courts. The practice English in law courts began to be enacted in 1362. The reason behind the declaration of implementation of this practice is none other than the frequent occurrence of major legal problems, such as deception of church officials, dukes, even civilization, and etc. And then because the French language is not known as a language that is easily understood and recognized in that region. So, the King Edward III finally wanted and agreed that all defense that had to be submitted in any court before any minister and in any other rule within the territory in this context means English territory must be carried out in English. And then main reason for using English. Yup, the main reason for using English in courts of law is because French is a language that is far unknown to most people in their area. So that it has caused previous courts which use French to not be fairly complete with it. And this caused adequate and anyhow much to do in the English language. And then the fourth point, we know the English language is the main language used around the world. That not used only for teaching law, but also for practice. The first work as tool of trade for lawyers. Of course, we know that increasing mastery of English vocabulary will surely help us as a lawyer in legal matters. And then, this is because many textbooks, case laws, and journals are usually printed in English and have term or abbreviation in the language that will make the job faster. And the fifth point, legal abbreviation. In the field of law, of course, there are lots of abbreviation that we can find, right? But in here, I will only give example of popular abbreviation in law, such as CJ for Chief Justice, LJ Lord Justice, JCA Judge of the Court of Appeal, and FCJ Federal Court Judge. And now we move to the next point of materials. Point number 106. English in the school. The first background of history English in the school. History in shortly after the conquest, France replaced English as the medium of instruction in the schools. In the 12th century, there were complaints that formal education was in English, but was now in France because other people now teach our folk. Until the 14th century, the use of French in the school was quite in general. And then the Black Death. After the Black Death. Yep, as explained by the previous group, the Black Death is the sign of the bubonic plague, which killed a third of the population in England around 1348. Okay, back to the main topic. So after the Black Death, two Oxford schoolmasters were responsible for a great innovation in English education, namely John Cornwall and Penrith. Thus, the schoolmaster introduced English as the vehicle of instruction in their schools, probably because of scarcity of competent teachers, right? Because I still don't know the main reason about that. And anyhow, after the middle of the 14th century, English began to be used in the school, and by 1384, the practice becomes general. Okay, that's just the material for me. The next material will be presented by my partner, Ayu Martin. Ayu Martin, time is yours.
Well, I'm Ayu Martin will explain the material about increasing ignorance of French in the 15th century and French as a language of culture and fashion. Ignorance of the French language has been quite common among the ruling class in England since the early 15th century. Throughout the 15th century, the ability to speak French fluently had been seen as an achievement compared to the ability to write
which had become less popular among the nobility. However, before the middle of the century, there needed to be a secretary in France among government officials. For example, case of increasing ignorance of French. First, in 1400, George Dunbar, Earl of March, in writing to the king in English, said that he wrote letters in English because they were clearer to his understanding than Latin or French. In another case, in 1403, regarding a letter from Richard Kingston, Dean of Windsor, addressed to the king. Out of respect for custom, the Dean began boldly writing in French, but towards the end he instinctively switched from French to English in the middle of a sentence. Then in 1404, a case occurred. The King of France had refused to recognize Henry IV when he usurped the throne of England, and his relatives, the French vented their anger on the English subject, and finally an attempt was made to resolve the issue through negotiations. The British ambassador complained about the use of French by their French correspondents and asked them to write only in Latin. On 2 occasions, they spoke of French as an unfamiliar language, such as Hebrew. The Richton, as a lawyer who certainly knows French well, he argued that the statement was not true, while the British delegates would not accuse such a reason for negotiating in Latin if there was no plausible reason. French as a language of culture and fashion. When French is no longer used as a spoken language in England, in addition to its limited scope, the reason for its cultivation have changed. In the first decade of the 15th century, John Barton wrote Donnet Francois, a treatise aimed at adults who wanted to learn French. In his treatise, he included 3 reasons. First, French will allow them to communicate with their neighbors in French territory. Second, their laws are mostly written in French. Third, men and women are willing to write to each other in French. Then, Caxton, in his dialogue in French and English, is especially concerned with traders, saying who will or want to study this book, perhaps companies are taking handed merchandise from one country to another. But France has been a feature of a privileged class for so long that its cultivation as it has endured in this century and beyond has been driven in large part by the feeling that it is the language of culture and fashion. This feeling was amplified in the 18th century and is present in the minds of many today. Okay, next material will be explained by my friend Aztri. Aztri, please, time is yours.
Okay guys, thank you for the time. Now I will explain about the use of English in writing. The last step that the English language had to make in its gradual ascent was in employment in writing. This is because in their respect it had to compete with Latin and French. Actually, French was the first language in England to break the monopoly of Latin in writing. The earliest letters written in English start appear in the latter part of the 14th century. The situation was rather similar with Wales. In 1397, the Earl of Kent made his will in English, and in 1438, the Countess of Stanford did likewise. After that, in the 15th century, English was adopted for the record of town and guilds, as well as in some branch of central government. In 1430, some towns translated their ordinance and book of custom into an English, so that English became generally used in their transaction after 1450. It was likewise with the guilds, in some of which English was used along with French in their ordinance. There are similar cases with the record of Parliament. For example, the petition of the Commons on which stages began to appear in English alongside with French in 1485. The reign of King Henry V marked the turning point in the use of English in writing. For example, the king used English in his correspondence and certain effort of his to promote the use of English in writing. At the end of the King Henry V and the beginning of the next marked period, English began to be generally adopted in writing. Next, I will explain about Middle English literature. The separation of the English nobility from French around the year 1250 and the spread of English among the upper class is reflected in the next 100 years of English literature. In this time, polite literature appeared in English. The most popular type in this literature at this time was that romance. Actually guys, only one English romance exists before. But from this time on, translation and adaptation from French into an English began to appear and their number increased largely during the 14th century. The years between 1250 until 1350 is labeled the period of religious and secular literature in English literature. This period indicates clearly the wider spread of the English language. The general employment of English by all castes, which took place by the latter half of the 14th century, resulted in a body of literature that represented the high point in English literature during the Middle Ages. The period from 1350 until 1400 has been called the period of great individual writer, because in this period there were many great individual writers. For example, Geoffrey Chaucer, he is the greatest English poet before Shakespeare. He composed a long narrative form, Come Turles and Cresside. Next is Piers Plowman. He is the reputed author of a long social allegory. Last is John Wycliffe. He is now a putative translator of the Bible and the author of a large and influential body of controversial. The 15th century is sometimes called the imitative period. These authors carry on the traditional English as a literary medium into the Renaissance. Thus, English literature during the Middle English period shed interesting light on the status of the English language. Okay guys, I think that's all for me. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, the next session is the conclusion. The conclusion of our material is the scale of the epidemic or disease, the Black Death, that emerged in the 14th century and killed 2/3 of people in Europe, became the cause of changing the order of life and the progress of countries in Europe. In the 14th century, the English language began to find its peak of glory in Europe, but in law, courts, and school, so that the French language is no longer used because of its limited scope. Okay, that's all from us. Does any have any question? If you want to ask, please type in the comment column. We will give you a change for 3 questions. Thank you for today, everyone. Thank you very much for attention, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you.